timely.
Yeah.
What happened?
Richard, you ain't how the two of them greeting one another, Robert and Paul. You ain't hearing them?
I hear it very clearly.
Senate people now. People from the Senate now.
Yeah.
Hold on now, Wendell. Morning, Rob.
Hey, good morning, Mr. Khan. How are you, sir? Good morning,
Good,
Wendell.
how you going?
I've never called him anything else but Mr. Lahunt. Good morning, Mr. Lahunt.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Lahunt.
Good morning, sir.
Thank you for joining us this morning. Let's jump straight into the meat of the matter and not deviate from the prescribed conversation course this morning. Let's start with, of course, recently.
What was all this? What was this course about?
I wasn't hearing clearly, so I can't see.
Oh, right. Okay, then.
We were talking Senate talk, Mr. Lahan. Talks about the Senate, of what you will all be too familiar with.
Oh, okay then. Well, Paul, I hope, I don't know what was the latest, but I do hope that, we would still be getting your expert and your sage counsel from the Senate benches later today. I mean, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, said like
so Robert is in Washington. Robert, let's start with the recent visit of the Ashanti King and the delegation from Africa that visited Trinidad and Tobago, which at emancipation celebrations. Being someone who's worked and has close ties to the continent, what do you think is the significance of that visit, culturally and economically?
Well, first to begin, I think that the visit of the Ashanti was I participated in a number of the functions, and I think it was well received by him. Having had some time to speak to him directly, I think it was well appreciated, and well appreciated by a number of the people who came. I think the visit had benefits on both sides. I think a lot of people in his delegation, starting there, who were not 100% familiar with Trinidad, and they were able to recognize and experience the similarities and the connections to the people and to the place of Trinidad and Tobago. So from that perspective, it was well received from their side. From our side, I think, whether a big part of the descendants of Trinidad and Tobago originated or came from Ghana or West Africa, I think a lot of people from Trinidad and Tobago did not recognize, when you listen to our history, or you read our history, you only hear about us coming across on the slave trade and the ship. And a lot of times our life starts from that perspective, we being descendants of slaves. I think it was important, and we have heard, or some of us might have heard about the Ashanti Kingdom, but we know about monarchies around the world. We know, of course, we all know about our king and our queen. We were part of the British system. I think it was important to a number of people of African descent for them to understand part of their history, which is your history, that, they do. Part of where they came from, you do have people like kings, like the Ashanti, you have kingdoms, you have people who... So from that perspective, it was important for Trinidadians of Africa.
Are you surprised that there's still so much ignorance, and I'm not saying ignorance in a pejorative term, but ignorance in terms of a lack of knowledge about African ancestry and links to Trinidad and Tobago past the atrocities of slavery, because a lot of emphasis is continuously placed on the atrocities of slavery, rightly so in many contexts, but about the rich and noble heritage that has come out of Africa.
Yes, I mean, I think it is. I am still surprised, but again, it is at all levels, and again, a lot of people don't. It is just part of. I think the connection, the umbilical cord was severely cut. There was no connection back to Africa, and I mean, Trinidad, people of African descent in the region lost all connections. If you recognize a lot of the other races, I mean, via movies, via heritage, via people going backward and forward. I mean, when I grew up, for example, I grew up recognizing that you could have gone to an Indian movie on cinema, all right, from since I was small. And that connection of movies, for example, allowed people to understand it or continue to have a connection to their Indian heritage and understand what happens with the Dori, and even a lot of our Trinidadians who look at the Indian movies when we were small were then able to understand the Indian culture. Those types of connections were not kept with Africa. And therefore, to an extent, no, I'm not surprised. It's unfortunate, but I'm not surprised. That is just, it is what it is. So I think this was an important visit from that perspective, to build back that bridge.
Mr. Lahan,
I also think it's also important from an economic perspective because, I mean, as I have said a lot of times, I think Africa or Africa is the future and is the new frontier for business and business activity.
Mr. Lahan, I've had an interest in Africa, Ghana in particular, largely because of you introducing me to that part of the world, and of course we had a delegation went there twice. Who were some of the businessmen who came to Trinidad with the Asante King, and in terms of the opportunities that would present itself to people like us?
Well, there were lots of, I mean, I know for sure there were lots of people some people in the financial sector who had projects and they were looking to seek financing. So there were lots of connections with some of the banks to discuss certain projects. There was, of course, Mr. Yufi Grant, who was the head of Ghana Investment Promotions. There was Miss I think the lady name is Miss Asari, who was also one of the leading people from the government perspective.
I saw Mr. Zwenis was also here. Charles Zwenis.
Charles Zwenis. There was a large delegation coming from Republic Bank in Ghana, and Mr. Zwenis and the new chairman of Republic Bank and a lot of the board of directors of Republic Bank in Ghana. And there were actually a lot of other people in other industries. A lot of small business people were also here exploring the particular landscape. And they had also some very interesting conversations, I mean, they went, a lot of the delegations met with the Minister of Trade. They visited Angostura, which again was a very enlightening visit. I missed that visit, but I understood there were lots of connections made there during that visit for future export of our products. And by and large, I mean, based on the interviews given, the visit was deemed a success by all.
What needs to happen? Because I've heard about delegations between Trinidad and Tobago and various African countries, including Ghana, in the past. I know we've had expertise going to, is it Nigeria's developing oil regime and stuff like that. But we never seem to, maybe it's happening, I don't know, see it materialize into tangible trade and other types of benefits. What needs to happen now from the Trinidad and Tobago side to maximize the potential of these linkages?
Well, ironically, I mean, Paul, I'm not sure that one of the things that this is a build-up of things that have been happening. September the 7th was CARICOM African Day. That was September the 7th. So that's a day where the whole link between CARICOM and Africa itself, and that bringing together of the two areas was also celebrated. So we are speaking at a very opportune time. Just was it 3 days past the celebration of that particular day. But yes, you know, at the end of the day, a lot of what needs to happen is private sector on both sides. I mean, governments could only provide the opportunity for things. Government could also have these trade missions, and governments and the Minister of Trade could visit to Ghana, which I understand that a visit is being planned to take a delegation of business. There have also been a lot of business people who have also visited Ghana via Republic Bank connections. But this is really an opportunity for business, for business connections and private sectors to get going. I mean, when you look at the African continent is in itself is about 1.4 billion people. And what is important is that over 60% of those people are under the age of 35. And that is the kind of size by 2050, 1 in every 4 people in the world, persons in the world, will be of African descent. So when you're talking about the size of that market and what the African contingent was what they were purporting or what they were saying is that they're looking for partnerships because there are lots of raw material in Africa. There are lots of agricultural products in Africa. Trinidad and Tobago, as a country, a small nation that always punches above its weight, is a nation that is good in manufacturing and the transporting and the turning of raw materials into finished products. And therefore, what they saw was the potential of, on this side, you have someone that is good in manufacturing, and they have a lot of raw materials. So it really is left up to the private sector. And I think to take the plunge, take the challenge, and see how we could set up businesses in Africa, how we could make those types of partnerships so as to allow for greater business. I mean, this is really about business. I know.
Now you said the government's really limited, but the government in terms of trade and industry, and I guess tourism, is critical in facilitating the ease of doing business with these kinds of connections. Do you think we're doing all that we should be doing?
Well, you know, I think there is always room to do. I think we are doing a lot, but I think there's always room to do more. And I will say, I mean, I have privately, I can't take, but I mean, I've attended about 3 or 4 really big meetings with a lot of our big manufacturers of people who are actually coming out to the visit, seriously looking at exploring and doing, exploring and setting up and doing business with Africans. So I think from that perspective, it is successful. I know the ministry is also looking, because I think that was also something that was needed. I mean, a lot of times, a lot of governments throughout the world, how they promote trade is via the embassies, and they also have attached to the embassies a particular person who is responsible for trade and trade promotions, and who has that type of connection with the private sector and is actually working out in the ministry. The US government does it, the UK government, a lot of the Europeans do it. And therefore, I think we are also moving. Trinidad, I think they're doing that this year. I heard the Minister of Trade has announced 7 areas that they will be, so 7 embassies that they will be sending someone. They just appointed someone to the United States. So that is another degree of facilitation. But governments could do just that much. It requires the private sector. Yes, they could probably, and some of the requests that were made were some double taxation treaties to be set up. But when Republic Bank, for example, decided to go to Africa in 2010, 2011, it was a business decision. It was a decision driven by you looking at the size of the market, and all that we are now hearing was part of the analysis done way back in 2010. We recognized that the markets, Trinidad as a bank, we needed to grow and operate in the bigger market. We felt that we were a little bit mannish, as you might want to call us, that we felt we had the skills to be able to go international. And we saw the potential of the Ghanaian market, which at the time, as I said, Ghana had 31 million people. And the intention was not just to enter Ghana, but to enter the African market via Ghana. And when you enter that bigger market, you're talking about 1.4 billion people in a free trade zone. West Africa alone, you're talking about over 300 million people. So the potential to be able to apply your trade in those bigger markets, there's a lot of financial incentives. I've said before, I mean, things like air transport will assist, but again,
I'm happy you raised that issue, Mr. Hunte, of air transport, because that would have been my next question to you. In terms of the access to Africa from the Caribbean, it's been very difficult, very tedious. How have we been looking at making it easier for people to get from the Caribbean to Africa? I think we did it once, I think from Barbados, a flight, but I don't think we've had it again since.
Well, again, I mean, you know, I take the view that, yes, we could look to government, but we have to look away from government, because at the end of the day, we have to look to the private sector to take up these challenges and do it. The truth of the matter is, to set up a flight, a daily flight, it's a very expensive thing. When you're setting up a route in discussions with BW or Caribbean Airlines or Peace Air, you need to have a plane. So it is practical. You could get a plane. It will result in a lot of the savings. With regard to time, a direct flight will take about 7 hours compared to about 24 hours to get there. It will be cheaper. Yes, all of those things are ticks, but you require volume and people. All right. Otherwise, there's a big subsidy that needs to be paid for that flight. And who should pay that subsidy? Should that be the government paying the subsidy to try to set up the route? And when we get the results from Caribbean Airlines and we see that they're losing more money, should the whole of Trinidad and Tobago pay? Or is that something that needs to be set up via charters on a private sector basis? And when the volumes reach the critical mass and could afford a daily flight or a weekly flight, then that's set up. Then that is set up. Because when you look at the numbers, it is a very expensive proposition to subsidize a flight. So yes, it would be nice. But again, I go back to Republic Bank. When they set up or they choose to go, right, it was driven by a business decision. And in spite of the flights being long, I remember doing that flight twice a week, 3 times a week, backward and forward. I mean,
wow.
Wow. A lot. But that is what it takes if you want to get something done.
But should the government look at it?
How is Republic Bank doing now in Ghana, though? I know initially they suffered some losses, I think, but has that gotten stable now? Are you aware? I should ask you first of all.
Well, again, I think the first thing again, I mean, when I left in 2017 and they were actually making a profit. So there have been ups and downs. The Ghanaian economy has had changes in their exchange rates. And as a result of that, they have had some challenges. But based on, I think 1 year ago, the subsidiary was the second best subsidiary in Republic Bank. Last year, the profits were affected by some endogenous circumstances. So it goes up and goes down. But I think for 1 or 2 years, they have been number 1 or number 2 best performing subsidiary in the Republic Bank Group. So by and large, the investment has been successful. I think the next stage, and I mean, I'm not there now, but the objective at the time was Ghana was an entry point. And I think the group needs to start to look and see how do we expand on the African continent. Because again, as I said, you're talking about a large volume of people, much more than we in Trinidad, right here in Trinidad and in the Caribbean region.
Just in terms of scale, I guess the potential is there. Should the government be looking at this? If there's a plan, because Republic Bank is a kind of different case because they have the assets and the capital to do that as a private sector entity, because it's a huge operation. For medium-sized businesses, let's say, I wouldn't say small or micro, for medium-sized businesses wishing to take advantage of that huge market, because I mean, the market is huge. Should the government look at that sort of flight arrangement as an investment with a plan moving forward, because it's an investment in furthering the economic growth of Trinidad and Tobago, essentially, through medium-sized businesses?
Again, it is, as I said, Sparrow said there's very little you could do without money. You can't make love without money. You can't make love on an empty belly. At the end of the day,
hungry belly.
And a hungry belly. It all depends. It comes down to financing. It comes down to, you're right, Paul, that might be an option, but there's a financial number associated with that. I mean, what is the kind of loss that you're talking about? All right. It might be nice to do, but I would think that what needs to happen, and I think it's there, I think the private sector individuals needs to get together and do a charter. Let's start with that. Let's start with a charter. Let's start with a charter around one of our festivals, around Carnival, around Emancipation Day. All right. A lot of small business people from Ghana finds themselves here in Emancipation Day, and they do a good trade. All right. And they keep coming every year. And I suppose the reason why they come is because they do good business. So in the same way, we need to take up the challenge and go there and take some of our festivals across there. That's the kind of connection that needs to be started to make. I mean, as you heard, I mean, some people have gone, and I know they're looking at developing Carnival. So those are the types of things and the connections that we need to make. Yes, we could look at the government to do more. The governments could always do more, but governments do not have a bottomless pit of money, and they need to then stretch those resources in a number of different ways. But my message has always been that, you know, the private sector needs to start to look at it and see how we could explore that particular market.
Now, you're the Inter-American Bank Group Executive Director for the Caribbean. I read an article recently in the Barbados Nation where you quoted as saying the Caribbean as a whole needs about $20 billion to meet its sustainable development goals. And I want to talk a little bit about climate change. Let's talk about Trinidad and Tobago in that context, and how you think the IDB can or is facilitating Trinidad and Tobago, supporting Trinidad and Tobago in that regard. I know there have been some, I don't know if it's loans or investments, some focus on digitization, on modernization of systems, etc. What is the IDB's role in this sort of enterprise? Because we spoke earlier on, and it's something Richard always speaks about the importance of digitization. We have 2 years now going on Ministry of Digitization, but he referenced Barbados being able to seniors being able to tap in a bus now and pay, and and the advantages of a digitized society. We do have to go into that. Is obvious or are obvious.
Well, again, you know, I mean, the IDB is a development bank. It's the largest development bank for Latin America and the Caribbean. And therefore, the IDB is made up of a number of member countries, 5 of them from the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago, together with most of the Latin American countries. And the whole IDB mission is about improving lives. I mean, the IDB has been working in Trinidad and Tobago for a number of years. Thursday, ironically, Uric Bob visited me at my office. And as you would know, Uric Bob was a governor in Trinidad and Tobago, and he went on after leaving here. He was the chief of staff at the IDB about 15 years ago. So we have had a long relationship with the IDB. The IDB has worked in Trinidad and Tobago in building a number of the schools, the secondary schools that you see when that time happened, when we moved into the junior secondary school system. All those schools were built out of loans coming out of the IDB way back then. Today, I know we are working a lot we have just approved a very large loan, one that I'm very familiar with, in the water sector for about 315 million to work in assisting and providing financing to transform that particular sector. We are working with the Ministry of Digitization. We are working with the Ministry of Works. We are working with the Ministry of Energy. And we are exploring a number of projects. We just funded a project, a roadmap on the hydrogen economy, and trying to see how we could guide the Trinidad and Tobago government to get into that industry. But the IDB as a development institution do not only provide financing. The IDB is known as a knowledge bank. And they are an institution, and when there are problems in a particular country, they come in. They also assist the country with technical assistance, getting the best expertise to solve the problem, and then develop a business case, and then they also finance the problem. Hence the reason when I was a minister, I went to them in looking at the water sector, and they came up with a plan at the time to deal with the water situation and also fund the water situation. So that's the kind of relationship that the IDB works. We are doing a lot of job work now with the Ministry of Digitization and funding their transition. Now, one thing I do know about digitization, there's a lot of work up front that needs to be put in place. A lot of times you think nothing is happening, but there's a lot of investment that needs to happen up front. And then, because you have to get it right at the end, I spent some time after leaving government with Answer Bank in setting them up. And I could tell you, it took about a year and a half before we were able to build out the required applications. When you see an application, you think, well, all right, it's easy and it makes life very simple. But there's a process about almost 2 years before that happens. So a lot of work has been done in the back with the Ministry of Digitization, which is an important initiative in Trinidad and Tobago. I say the region needs to look at digitization because we need to get government operating more efficiently. And digitization provides that process or gives that platform for that to happen. All right. So we are doing a lot of work in the country with a number of different ministries. Ministry of Education, I know we are also in high-end discussions with them at present in assisting them in their Tech VOC program and how we could improve that program. So we are doing a lot of work. I'm working with a lot of the ministers now in Trinidad and Tobago in trying to advance the whole development initiative.
I know you said that as Paul referenced, the US 20 billion that the region needs to meet the sustainable goals. And you also talked a lot about private investment, the private sector having to be more involved. Is it that the private sector in the Caribbean is too conservative in your mind or in your sense of it?
Well, listen to me. The amount of money that the region requires, as you heard, about $20 billion just by 2030 to deal with our sustainable development goals. And what is important from that statement, if you're in that particular article I mentioned, if, for example, that money is not spent, the impact by 2050 of doing nothing is going to be also very tremendous, a high amount of money that is going to impact. We all know this region, for example, as an issue as it relates to climate. I mean, I'm sure you could feel it every day. We are getting hotter. Every day is getting hotter and hotter. And that's not only in Trinidad and Tobago, it's throughout the world. And that is a significant. So in addition to that 20 billion that you are talking about that is required for us to meet sustainable development goals, there's a significant investment that is also required in meeting our climate and building out new resilient infrastructure for the region to deal with climate. I mean, I saw the G7 just signed off, and they were talking about, I think I wrote it down, about 5.9 trillion is needed by 2030 in developing countries, of which the region is one of them. So there's a tremendous amount of money. Listen, the reality is development banks cannot lend that money. Governments can't. So it's a combination of development banks have to find that money to lend, governments have to provide, and private sector also need to mobilize to get involved in dealing with a number of those issues. So yes, private sector needs, and I mean, we're talking about that.
Do you think enough attention is being placed by Trinidad and Tobago on that issue of climate change and the work being done behind the scenes?
I didn't get the question, Paul. Sorry.
Do you think there's enough emphasis being placed on the climate change issues? Because I know some of the European countries have actually taken policy positions that climate change is imminent, what's happening already. They have to invest in mitigation, but they're also using the mitigation to position them in other areas to be economically advantaged. So they're not only looking at it as well, we have to catch up and fix it, but we have to position ourselves based on the potential to do better in other areas also. For example, hydrogen.
Well, I mean, again, that is the climate issue is the elephant in the room, all right? Mia Motley has been bringing that to the attention of the world a lot, especially the Caribbean plights. Because when you talk about that amount of money that is coming, you're talking about that climate issue, and it's meeting a lot of the Caribbean countries or the countries in the region at a time when we have significant levels of debt, and also at a time when our own development, just to meet our sustainable development goals, there's still a lot of poverty in our region. So there is a lot of money to be spent in dealing with issues that we have undone, that needs to be fixed, and then there are the new issues that are coming on top of it. And the region has been affected for a long time by exactly the fact that we have been affected by a lot of natural disasters. Over 65%, what people are not, over 65% of the major natural disasters that have hit the world for small islands since 1960 has hit us in the Caribbean. So we have been spending a lot of money in building back ourselves as a region based on the effects of climate. So we have been having hurricanes in our region for a long time. It's just now getting worse. And therefore, one of the big issues that is up for conversation is who needs to pay or who should be paying to help those issues. We have not caused these climate issues. We have not been part of, we have not been big polluters of the world that is causing this. And therefore, there's a lot of discussions as to how we should be able to get the type of financing and get to be able to allow us to meet some of these challenges. So from that perspective, we need to mobilize and we need to continue to lobby as to how we are going to get the type of money to deal with some of the climate challenges. Yes, we do need to use some other measures, mitigation type measures, to help us get into new types of industries in the region. We need to look at things like hydrogen, and we need to look at wind and solar and all of those types of new type of ways of generating energy. And I think, as I said, I know we have been financing at the IDB, us looking at deeper at the hydrogen economy in Trinidad and Tobago. But the transition for countries like Trinidad and Tobago where we have been very much heavy into hydrocarbon type industries, and we now have to transition. That in itself is a challenge to a number of countries in the region, because a lot of people have already invested in long-term assets, right? And therefore, how are you going to deal with what the new word is stranded assets? It's also a new challenge. So there are lots of challenges into the region, and it requires a lot of thinking, it requires a lot of activities, but it is something that we do need to face.
And I asked you about whether you felt that the businesses in the Caribbean were too conservative, because oftentimes, you hear of all of these trade fairs, you hear of the digitization thrust, and the private sector, of course, is part of that. And I think thanks to COVID, a lot of them COVID was a catalyst for, I think, a lot of companies pushing more in that direction than they would have if there was not COVID, in terms of getting more into the online sphere, taking payments online, etc., etc. I think COVID was the main driver of that, because businesses have to survive and they adapt. And that was an adaptation to that particular circumstance. But overall, in terms of, because you often get the sense that businesses, speaking from a Trinidad and Tobago context, are very conservative about how they invest and where they invest. And I know governments have often said that they are risk averse in terms of being entrepreneurial enough to move us forward, especially in terms of the diversification from the energy economy, which we seem to be, very anchored in. And I get it, that it's still a big part of what Trinidad and Tobago is, but we've been talking about diversification since all of us here were in primary school. And have we really made the strides necessary?
Well, I do hear you, that I think, again, I've worked in the banking sector for a number of years, and you're right. Yes, I think you could, if the Trinidad business, a big part of the Trinidad business community has stayed very safely into areas of distribution. There have been some, the Essentials, the Associated Brands of the world, who have actually gone out and taken a lot of, there are companies in Trinidad who have actually set up plants in Malta and around the world and are actually operating. So there have been some successes from that perspective. But yes, I do agree that I think there are a number of areas of opportunities that our business community needs to start to look at and get involved. I think there is a significant opportunities in areas of agriculture that I feel we could spend some more business entrepreneurial money and skills in. And there are lots of technology surrounding agriculture that could make agriculture very viable for people to want to do, but it requires some new thinking and requires.
But my understanding is that the Ministry of Youth and National Service is doing that.
Who? Beg pardon?
My understanding is that the Ministry of Youth and National Service through Foster Cummings is doing a bit of that and introducing younger people to agriculture.
Yes, and I think that's a great initiative. So, I think more could be done from the private sector. So the government is pushing people in that regard, but we were talking about the private sector business getting more involved in it. And I think, yes, a lot of our traditional business people need to start to see agriculture as a viable alternative. All right. But I think a lot of it comes back to again, governments could do just as much. We talked about agriculture just now, and we talked to the Ministry of Youth, and they are doing their part. But I think that spirit of entrepreneurship and wanting to do something different on wanting to diversify the economy. I think a lot of the business people need to take that ownership to want to do something to make Trinidad better and get involved and get more involved in other types of industry. So yes, there is room on both sides. I've heard a lot about governments doing the work to try to make the environment more business friendly, all right? But I also believe that once the environment becomes business friendly, you also have to have a spirit, an entrepreneurial spirit for the business people to want to get involved in it also. And there are a number of incentives, you know. I mean, one of the things I'm remembering from my time, if you research the levels of incentives that we have in this country for people to get involved, one day I challenge you to go and look at that. All right, there's almost an incentive for anything, and one asks himself, if you ask yourself, why haven't we been able? Why are people not taking up the incentives? Is another question, which, as I said, I think if we start,
doesn't that come back to an issue of leadership? And I'm not just talking about political leadership. I'm talking about leadership as an issue in small island states, and that issue of motivation and the issue of inspiration in terms, which is a intangible but certainly trackable thing in terms of how people feel and about the respective spaces they live in the Caribbean, and wanting to be an entrepreneur there, less as a survival, but more as an investment into the country. Survival is always important. Businesses have to survive. But that issue of investing in the country, and is the lack of take-up of those incentives, which is what you're suggesting, part of a national psyche that doesn't feel inspired and hopeful in the future? And if that is so, how do you change that?
Well, I mean, you put that on the table, but I also put on the table, isn't that not a function of our comfort level? I don't know. I mean, I hear what you are saying, but I also put on the table, is it a function of our comfort level? Is it a function that the fact that there's life in the region itself? And when you travel and you recognize the level of poverty that you have in a number of Latin American, Caribbean countries, just right our neighbors, you go to some of these countries and you compare them to the region, or you go to Africa and you see poverty, you realize that in a lot of times, a lot of the people in the Caribbean region, we live a very comfortable life, even at our lowest level, the lowest level. When you talk about poverty in those areas, it is serious poverty. So in answering your question, I hear this issue of leadership, and that is always different people have different things that motivates them. All right. And I mean, what motivates you might not be something that motivates me. So leadership is a nebulous conversation that we could talk about, but I also would like to put on the table, is it also part of our own comfort level that we're too comfortable? So we could get into that. I always believe that there is always room for improving the business environment, but there's also an ownership that people need to also want to take. There's also why, I mean, I have always admired when I go to Jamaica, the national pride that Jamaicans have for the little that they have. And people talk about whether or not we have that in Trinidad or not. I mean, I'm not going to get into those kind of conversations now, but what it is that happens there that doesn't happen here. To what extent that we live in a polarized society here, and we celebrate it as part of our life in Carnival, and we talk about it. But to what extent have we dug deep to determine exactly what are some of the undercurrents that we do have in Trinidad that prevents us from operating and building as a society? Those are some conversations over 60 years of independence have passed that I think we have been not having. And therefore, as a result, there's a number of, as I said, still waters run deep in Trinidad and Tobago that we still need to explore for us to be able to build out as a society.
We I think we're afraid to come.
Undercurrents anymore, no?
In our last 2 minutes, Robert, can you give us a sense? Because I know you were involved at a high level in Answer Bank. And they have a kind of cashless drive. We spoke about digitization earlier on. You think we're on our way to a cashless society anytime soon?
I think the idea, the reality is digitization and moving to a cashless society. Whether we want to be on it or not, it's a road. It is coming. It's like a tidal wave, and we better get onto it. All right. I think we are, as a cashless society, we are better than a lot of people, a lot of other countries. But I think there is definitely room for more. I strongly believe in the work that is being done by digitization because, as I said, we need to make our system and our governments a lot more efficient. And to me, when you're running a government or you're running a country and you have variable income, as a business person, the best thing that you could do is to try to be as efficient as you can. And therefore, digitization will provide that initiative. I think digitization will also allow for governments to identify who needs the assistance in Trinidad and Tobago. So that's another area that I think we need to work on, in that, you know, there's a lot of subsidies, there's a lot but we need to be more targeted in our subsidies, right? And I think the digitization will allow for that to happen. So I think we are on our way. We could always do it a lot faster. All right. And I think based on the work that I know that is happening in the Ministry of Digitization, I think there's a lot around the corner to come very soon, because I know a lot of background work has also been done by the minister. And therefore, I think I live in hope.
Robert, thank you as usual for being with us this morning. It was an interesting conversation and quite a range of issues. Enjoy the weather in DC. It's getting frosty.
Yes, we are getting but it's a nice. We are enjoying the last few days of summer. Thanks again. Thanks you guys, of all, Wendell, Richard, Paul. Good luck this evening. I don't know. I hope that, as I said,
Good luck.
Still being
It's not a
present.
matter of luck. It's a matter of whatever the choice is made.
Well, again, you know, from our perspective, we just want to know that we appreciate your contribution. I always learn, I think people who are giving national service, right, and who are giving back to their community and their country is important, and they don't get enough recognition, and that they don't get enough kudos for that selfless work. So I want to thank you on behalf of, I'm sure, all of Trinidad and Tobago, whether you stay with us or not, for the contribution that you have done in the past, and looking forward to your continued contribution going forward. So with that, Trinidad and Tobago, it's always a pleasure to engage both of you guys and the wider population. Thanks again, and all the best.
Thanks, Aaron.
Okay, Mr.